Good evening. My name is Scott Thomas. I'm the Dean of the School of Educational Studies here at Claremont Graduate University, and I would like to welcome you to the first annual John Regan Lecture. And tonight we have three esteemed educational experts. Bless you. Three esteemed educational experts that I will introduce momentarily. But before we get going, let me say a word of thanks to Professor Emeritus John Regan, who was on the faculty here at Claremont Graduate University for many years and had a strong interest in cultural studies and communication, and left an indelible imprint on our programming and on our legacy nationally and internationally, if not through a scholarship alone, through the very impressive list of speakers and distinguished scholars that he brought through Claremont Graduate University over the years. And we're grateful for John's contribution that makes tonight's lecture possible. And I would like to welcome you and thank you for coming this evening. Tonight we're going to talk about the theme of the speaker series at the School of Educational Studies is Education at the Crossroads, Research, Policy, and Practice. And tonight we'll be talking about California politics, and we'll be hearing two people who've been very politically involved over their careers about politics around education in California, and some thoughts about why we are where we are generally, and where we might be going with this. And we have a very impressive group of folks to get the conversation going. We'll have a dialogue among the speakers for roughly 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll open it up for questions and conversation for the remainder of our time. Let me introduce first Professor and Provost Jacob Adams in the center. Jacob is an expert in educational finance. His research and teaching focuses on the policy context of K-12 education, with particular attention to the ways in which governance and finance policies and implementation practice and influence school capacity. I don't think any of that made sense, but these practices influence school capacity is what I'm trying to say. Jacob has served in numerous policy and advising roles, and his early involvement included some work on the Committee on Ways and Means in the U.S. House of Representatives. He was a field organizer for Common Cause and a campaign and administrative staff to California's former state superintendent, Bill Honig. Under Bill Honig, Adams became the first associate director of policy analysis for California education, also known as PACE. It's a research center at Cal Berkeley and at Stanford. He chaired the board of directors for the Kentucky Institute of Education Research, and he served on the national advisory boards for Standard & Poor's School Evaluation Services and the National Governance Association Redesigning the American High School Initiative. Jacob has been a consultant to the Commission on Governing America's Schools, the National Forum on Accountability, the National Research Council, and the National Education Association. He will be moderating tonight's discussion between Jack Scott and Carl Cohn. Professor Carl Cohn. Professor Cohn is the director of our Urban Leadership Program within the School of Educational Studies. Carl has an EDD from UCLA, a 30-year career in educational positions, teacher, counselor, professor, superintendent, federal court monitor, all-around political make-it-happen kind of guy. He was the superintendent of the Long Beach Unified School District for 10 years. During that time, or shortly after that time, the school district was a recipient of a Broad Prize. Carl is a recipient of the McGraw Prize. He chairs the, so many things. He chairs the American College Testing Service Board this year. He's worked with the Freedom Writers Foundation, the Western Governors University, and EdSource on their boards. Carl is currently co-chair on the committee of the 5-year summative evaluation of the Washington, D.C. public schools, among other things. Jack Scott. Jack Scott, where did you go? Jack, I couldn't talk about you unless I had notes.
Well, you don't have to talk about me.
Okay. Jack Scott is a PhD recipient from Claremont Graduate University in history. Jack is with us as our scholar in residence within the School of Educational Studies. Jack will be receiving next weekend, I believe, the Joe Allen Exemplar Award from the College Board in San Diego for his service in a variety of capacities, and those capacities include 12 years in the California legislature, 4 years in the Assembly, 8 years in the Senate, 3.5 years as the most recent chancellor of the California Community College system. He's been president of Pasadena Community College, president of Cypress College. He's worked at Pepperdine. He's worked at Orange Coast College. I'm sure I've missed 5, 6, 7, 8 things, Jack, but you get the idea. Jack has had a very distinguished and an impressive career in politics and education in California. Let me turn it over to Jacob, who will explain some ground rules, and then I think you have a little plan for giving us a little bit more information about Carl and Jack. So I'll turn it over to you, Jacob.
Indeed. Thank you, Scott. Good to see everybody tonight. It's a pleasure for the panelists to see you and be able to engage with you over the course of the evening. Scott mentioned in his introduction that at some earlier point in my career, I worked for a policy group that was a combination of UC Berkeley and Stanford. And we're going to talk about politics tonight, but once you get through that experience with Stanford and Berkeley, everything else is easy. I think we're going to start off by asking Carl and Jack to just spend a few minutes telling us a little bit about their backgrounds, off the biographies, but they bring a range of perspectives to the conversation tonight. And I think since we all know we see the world through the eyes where we sit, that it's important for you to get their sense of the places they have sat so that you can anticipate maybe what they might say or the perspectives they might bring to the table or the kinds of questions that you might want to ask them when we get to that part of the program. So, Carl, let me turn to you first and just say a few words. And you might start by not surprising everybody what's about to come out of your mouth here. Carl is a little under the weather, and it's all showing up in his voice.
Okay, very good. I started out studying to be a priest for the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. And given what you've been reading in the LA Times, I'm glad that I didn't continue in that line of work. And I can also say that the Long Beach school system was much better run than the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. I served as superintendent of schools in both Long Beach and San Diego. And what was important about that experience was the fact that even though these were very different school systems, I tried to bring my style of leadership to rescuing youngsters who historically had not been well served by the public school system. So even though I had an extraordinary run in Long Beach and a fairly short run in San Diego, I went to work every day trying to figure out how to motivate and inspire the adults who work with children. And I think that's the most important thing that you can do as the leader of a K-12 school system. I also learned to navigate politics throughout both of those experiences and throughout my career. And so in my teaching, I try and bring to students the skills necessary so that they won't go out into the arena and be victims of the politics that are inevitable in running any kind of an educational enterprise.
Jack?
Well, it's interesting to discover that Carl and I have something in common because I began my career studying to be a minister. In fact, I have a Master of Divinity degree from Yale University. And then I came to Claremont Graduate University and got a PhD in history. You know, there was a once popular song by Joni Mitchell. She would sing, "I've looked at life from both sides now." And I've had that experience. I spent 38 years, or have spent a total of 38 years in higher education, and then I spent 12 years in politics. I didn't start off to be a politician. I was a president of Pasadena City College, and some friends came to me, I think they were friends, and suggested that I seek public office. And I did that for the first time and fortunately was successful, elected to the Assembly twice, and then elected to the State Senate twice. And in those political roles, education was still my number one project. I voted on a lot of other things. In fact, I carried bills that involved many other things. But I served as chair of the Senate Education Committee. When I was in the Assembly, I was on both the Education and Higher Education Committee. And so I know something about the political process. Now, as Carl pointed out, obviously, education is political. Any institution has a certain amount of politics connected with it. And so I'm not suggesting that the only place that politics occurs is in Sacramento or Washington. But it's very much of a contact sport, I might tell you, up in Sacramento or in Washington as you pick up your newspaper and read. Tonight I will be able, in fact I've left some material at the back that explains the political process, how a budget is passed, how bills are initiated, what some of the major players are in Sacramento. And one of the reasons that Sacramento is so important is that the state plays a significant role in all of education. And any educator who ignores that fact does it at his or her own peril, because you will find that teacher qualifications, tenure, allocation of budgets, all of that happens in Sacramento. And so never think that, well, I'm not going to fool with politics because I'm over here in the pure world of education and I'll just let the politicians handle that. You may find out that you're not going to be real happy about the way upon which you're acting. So I think it's important for all educators to understand a little bit about the intersection and the impact, frankly, that politics has on education.
Thank you both. So we're going to start the questions here by channeling a mutual friend, Mike Kirst, who is at this moment the president of the State Board of Education, appointed by Jerry Brown, and who for a long time was a professor of education at Stanford, and happens to be one of the faculty members out there who wrote one of the most popular books on education politics. So since the topic tonight is politics of education in California, and since we all have a pretty good grasp on what California is, I thought we'd start off with Mike's definition of politics and build up from there. So Mike defined politics in this way. He said, politics is a form of social conflict rooted in group differences over values about using public resources to meet private needs. So in Mike's view, we're talking about conflict, groups, values, resources, and how all those things collide when different folks are trying to do different things in Sacramento, Washington, Claremont, Los Angeles, or wherever. So why don't we start this way and go right to the heart of it. And Jack, let's start with you. You've already mentioned politics as a contact sport. That's completely in keeping with Mike's definition here. So what would you say are the biggest conflicts in California politics today?
Well, there are, of course, financial conflicts, and there are ideological conflicts. And the spectrum goes all the way from the very conservative to the very liberal. And one of the unfortunate things that's happened in California politics is that frequently those ideological divergences become so moralistic and rancorous that the possibility of compromise is very difficult. And frankly, the process of politics is the process of compromise. Some people think that's a dirty word, and it maybe is a dirty word if you're talking about deeply held moral principles. But the only way you get something done, and that's true in education. I was president of a college at two different community colleges in California, and it was always like a little give and take. Not every idea that I had was able to be carried out. I listened carefully to the faculty. I recognized that there were various constituencies with which I had to deal, whether it was students, staff, the community, the board of trustees. That's a political situation that you're in. So I think conflict is inevitable, and as long as we can have respect for opposite views, work toward compromise. In fact, the genius of American democracy was built upon checks and balances. If you look back to the original Constitution and the fact that you have the judicial branch and the executive branch and the legislative branch, that all was a system of checks and balances. And in the Sacramento legislature, I can tell you that getting a bill through is very difficult because you've got to go through committees. You got to go through the original committee, then to the floor of that house, and then to the committee over in the other house, and then to the floor of that house, and then to the governor's desk, and then if he vetoes it, the game starts all over again. So I'm not someone who would say that conflict is bad. I would just simply say that if it is exceedingly rancorous and there's no respect for opposing viewpoints, then it does become very bad.
Carl, sitting on the state board, I'm sure you never see any conflicts before you.
I think the two biggest conflicts are looming in California. First, finance. How do we finance the public schools? And the governor has taken that on, and he is sponsoring a local control funding initiative, and he could have opted for the status quo, but he's arguing that this is a long-standing, unaddressed challenge, and he's going to spend some political capital to try and get it done. The debate, for those who love politics, is going to be fun to watch. The outcome is very uncertain. So you've got school finance. Secondly, you've got the issue of how we are going to evaluate teachers in California. So if you look at those two big issues, Mike Kerr's definition of politics and conflict, you are going to get huge battles. What always troubles me about the issue of how we evaluate teachers, it seems that we never learn from the places that are having some success. The school system that I headed 10 years ago was just named one of the 5 best school systems in the world. Long Beach, Singapore, Finland, Hong Kong, and Ontario, Canada. What absolutely astounds me, instead of debates around are evaluations going to be 30% of test scores or 50% of test scores, why don't we go to the places that are actually having some success and find out what they're doing? There is no debate in Long Beach about 30, 40, or 50% of test scores. It's all about bringing high-quality professional development and support to the people who do the work. So, big, huge conflicts coming, finance, and how we evaluate teachers.
Carl, let's stick with that topic for a minute here. You said that the governor put the local control funding on the table. How do these conflicts get on the table generally? I mean, who gets to call the shots?
Often it's interest groups. which in California includes 5 or 6 major educational interest groups, plus the legislature, and then ultimately the initiative process in California is a major sort of third rail wild card that some other states don't have. I just saw a bill being introduced in the legislature. When I first became a superintendent, if you were bought out of a contract, whatever years you had left on your contract, you got that paid out if a school board bought you out. Before I signed my first contract in 1992, that was changed to you can only be bought out for 18 months. Someone is introducing a bill in the legislature that reduces that 18 months to 3 months. And so here is an idea where someone in the legislature looked at a bad experience in Monterey County where some superintendent got bought out for a large amount of money. And so rather than holding that local school board accountable for whatever happened there, the elected representative from the area decides we need a state law to address this. So it comes from all sources, and one of the problems, I don't know how Jack feels about this, but every now and then it looks like the fact that we have full-time state legislators who sometimes need to justify their existence, they want to solve every problem.
That's the first smackdown question of the evening here.
Well, number one, of course, that often happens, that some legislator reacts to an abuse, and then the cure is worse than the disease. And in this case, what that would end up doing is, of course, making the superintendent's job less attractive. And it's fairly unattractive as it is. Remember that a superintendent does not have tenure, and I was a CEO, and I took on the job. I normally had a 3-year contract, and but you know, I would not want to suddenly realize that some shift in a board's election or something like that, I would be suddenly vulnerable. And so there's a reasonable amount of buyout, but certainly 3 months is very unreasonable. And my guess is that that won't go anywhere. What will happen is that individual has made his mark. It's kind of like I noticed where a legislator has now come up with the idea of arming teachers in the school. And he is also a fellow that was engaged in the militia at the border. And so he's making, in a very conservative district, he's kind of making his waves, but that won't even get out of a committee. And so, yes, legislators have egos involved, and I sometimes say that what the problem in California is, it's not the nature of the legislators, it's the nature of the system. And I can tell you some of the problems that we have in a system. But I found that in my experience in the 12 years I was in the legislature, that legislators are just like human beings. There were some of them I thought were the finest, people of great integrity, and others, frankly, weren't very trustworthy. So, you know, and most of the time, I have to say that people get what they deserve. They sometimes vote for people who demagogue and say things like, just what was said there. Somebody's got some prejudice against an administrator, and so, well, I'll get up there and I'll introduce that bill. You know, it was my experience that when people came in my office and they wanted me to introduce a bill, that I never introduced a bill, number one, that I thought was just for show, or number two, had no chance of being passed. I didn't really like to exercise that kind of futility, but there are legislators who do that, who simply carry a bill to make a mark knowing full well it has absolutely no chance of passage. And I'm just commenting on what you're saying there, but the same thing, I remember I was chair of the education committee, and some people got very upset at whoever at that time, the president of the University of California, And so they said, as legislators, they said he should be fired and we want him fired. And I thought, well, there's a Board of Regents that handles that job, and they will take care of it in their own way, perhaps handle it more diplomatically than what that legislator is. So, yes, legislators, Congress members, people often like to raise wave a flag of some kind. But also, as I said, there's some very dedicated, hardworking, thoughtful legislators.
Jack, when we asked the question, who gets to put things on the agenda, and Carl said legislators is one of those entities that gets to put something on the agenda. Well, you've been there a while. How much did you feel like you were the originator of the ideas of the agenda issues, or how much were you just a broker of all the interests that were coming into Sacramento?
Well, I tried to introduce bills that I believed in. Sometimes I introduced bills that a constituent would come to me with that I thought had merit. And on the other hand, there were times when a constituent would, I'd have to let the person down kind of easily, but I would more or less recognize that didn't make a lot of sense. Or I might say, that idea has merit, but I've got to be honest with you. Given the situation that exists in the legislature now, that really doesn't have any chance of passage. So we got to think that through. And I'm cutting to the chase here a little bit. As a politician, I did things with some diplomacy, as a college president does, or as a superintendent does. Sometimes I'm sure you had faculty members or others that would come into the superintendent's office with what they thought was the world's greatest idea, and you'd have to kind of let them down easily. You might even say things like, well, now that would cost, and you begin to put the cost factor out there, and suddenly that person recognizes that the possibility of that happening is not very good. So, I guess I end up with where Winston Churchill did when he said, democracy is the worst form of government possible, except it happens to be better than any other form of government.
Carl, the teacher evaluation agenda didn't come out of elected officials so much as it came out of foundations in the corporate world in part. How do they play a role in the politics in California?
They're increasingly playing a much, much bigger role. The Federal Department of Education in the Obama administration, several people went directly from both the Broad and Gates Foundation to the Department of Education. And the idea for Race to the Top as a competition came from the world of foundations. And I think one of the things often the research doesn't keep up with the phenomena. And as I look at it, they're playing an increasingly stronger role. And I'm not sure the world of research is actually looking at that. And I'm not sure the extent to which, and this is the other thing in a democracy that's troublesome, I'm not sure the media is paying that much attention. And someone recently raised the issue. If you look at Education Week as the national education newspaper of record, how much of their funding is coming from foundations who have an agenda, and to what extent can they be truly independent if, as a nonprofit, 50-60% of their funding is coming from foundations who want a certain kind of reform to be promoted in America? It's a legitimate question.
Jack, ostensibly, we in the electoral system, citizens can hold their elected officials accountable at the ballot box. But what kind of accountability do you see out there for the foundations, the interest groups, and the others who play very important roles, sometimes critical roles, in what happens in terms of the allocation of resources or the values of the policies that get allocated?
Well, Carl has talked a little bit about money, and of course, it's very clear to me that money is a very corrupting influence in politics, and about the only way that we can combat that is greater transparency. Frankly, I think it was unfortunate that the decision of the Supreme Court in terms of Citizens United made it possible for people to give large sums of money and not reveal that they have given large sums of money. I understand the term freedom of speech. I'm not quite sure that I think corporations and unions deserve the same kind of protection that individuals do. So I might disagree with the Supreme Court in its decision on Citizens United, but I do believe that there ought to be as much transparency as possible in revealing where the contributions come from, whether we're talking about foundations. You know, a lot of times when bills would come to, and fortunately I had a staff who analyzed bills, but I would often ask the question, where's the money? Because that's not the only thing that motivates things, but suddenly you see a bill, and then you suddenly realize, wait a minute, that legislator's introduced that bill, and that's going to profit one particular corporation. And a lot of times when that's revealed, then that bill is killed. But the point is, there are a lot of interest groups involved. And in education, and Carl referred to interest groups, you have the teacher unions, which of course CTA is the most powerful, having a great deal of money that they invest in elections. CFT, the CTA is California Teachers Association. CFT is California Federation of Teachers. Over in in CSU, you have the California Faculty Association, which is the union. Now, the University of California does not have a union. Their academic senate is a very powerful body. Then you have, of course, the administrators. Their organization is called AXA. You have school boards, the California School Boards Association. So all of those people are there, and they're playing a part in educational policy in California. And I'm not deprecating that. I'm saying that's perfectly understandable. However, you got to realize that they have a particular viewpoint. When lobbyists would come into my office, I would listen to them, but I knew I was listening to a pure advocate for a particular standpoint. It's kind of like being on a jury and getting to hear the prosecution and hearing the defense attorney. You know you're getting two different viewpoints, and it's your job as the jury to determine where you think the truth lies. And that's what you have to do as someone who is either an assembly member or a senator. But I'm not sure how to solve the money problem. The best way I knew how to do it, I had to raise money. There wasn't any way I could run for office without raising money, but I tried to spread it out enough to where I didn't feel beholden to any one particular group. That's the best thing I could do. But there was no way that I could represent 950,000 people, which I did in the state senate, and knock on every door. So I had to have some kind of money to get my message out. And so that's just part of the game. But I understand that the average Congress member or senator has to spend almost a majority of his or her day raising money. And folks, if that's not going to be, if that doesn't corrupt you, hardly anything would. So anyway, I posed the problem, unfortunately, without the solution.
And the conversation just took a different turn, too, from the... Now we're talking corruption. So, Carl, wait a minute, that's not, we're talking corruption. Carl, we're talking corruption, maybe semicolon. Carl now, all right. There are all kinds of overlapping accountability relationships, it seems like here. I mean, they're citizens with their elected officials, but now what Jack just put on the table is their union representatives to their rank and file, corporate executives to their boards and whatnot. So how do you sort out the accountability issues in the political context so that the citizens finally feel like they're getting a decent deal? Or can you?
Well, what you hope for is an honest media that actually describes what's going on. It's amazing to me that you have a Los Angeles school board race coming up and millions of dollars are pouring in addition to what we call the Billionaire Boys Club foundations. You have Mayor Bloomberg giving $1 million to a Los Angeles school board race. And then, with all due respect to the editorial board of the Los Angeles Times, you have an editorial this past Sunday or so where they talked about their picks for the school board. It was the most incoherent editorial that I've ever read in the Times. And at no point did they mention the fact that Mayor Bloomberg of New York was spending $1 million in Los Angeles. And I think the citizens are at a huge disadvantage. And the argument, if you had an honest argument about LA, it would be UTLA is so strong and they have so much money and they're so influential. The only way you get a fair fight is by billionaires loading up the other side. But I don't think that the media is doing a very good job of actually educating the public around those kinds of issues. And I think it's the type of thing where you really do need some sunlight as a disinfectant shining on these kinds of things. If the Bloomberg corporate reform agenda wins in Los Angeles, ultimately you're going to have a very different kind of school system. I've sat with Mayor Reardon. He would like to see Los Angeles become an all-charter district. Now, that may be okay, but you probably ought to have an honest, old-fashioned debate about whether or not that's a good thing for Los Angeles.
So the topic tonight is the politics of education in California. But Carl, you're starting to make it sound like the borders of California are permeable. And I wonder how does that crowd out the voices in California when you get the Bloombergs and the Gates Foundations and the others pouring in here?
Well, when I first became superintendent in San Diego, one of the first things I did, because Long Beach did not have a robust charter school movement, so San Diego did. So I met with the charter school folks in San Diego, and I asked them, how did this start? Were you dissatisfied with the current system? Where did this come from? And so I started in the communities of color, because there were a number of charter schools that came about, built up around churches. So I started with them. How did this get started? Several of the churches said, the Walton Foundation came and gave our pastors walk-around money to start these charter schools. And so the boundaries, this is an Arkansas foundation playing in the heart of San Diego, and basically started what has become a very robust charter school movement. But If you look at the conservative newspaper, the San Diego Union Tribune, you would never find out that the Arkansas-based Walton Foundation had been responsible for the development of these charter schools in Southeast San Diego. The Union Tribune would have argued that it's those bad, awful unions, the reason why these honest parents decided that
Sponsored by the Walton Foundation.
that they needed the charter schools. And I don't want to beat up on charter schools, but as a state board member, there's a fundamental lack of fairness. Regular school systems come to us for waivers ad nauseum. They're asking to go to the bathroom. They're asking permission of the state of California to do X, Y, and Z. Charter schools don't have to come to the state to ask us to waive anything. And basically, you're setting up an incredibly unfair comparison. You have a deregulated school system alongside one that has an education code that is about this high off the ground. And so in my world, comparisons that are fair and honest become very difficult. And at the state board, we spend an incredible amount of time on the regulatory aspects of this. And so I don't think we should take away the deregulated charters, but I think we ought to deregulate the regular public schools.
Jack, let me ask a different kind of question here. Put your practitioner hat back on from your community college days here. Carl, this one's coming to you too here. We've been talking about the jumble of politics, all the different influences that are in it, the conflicts, the different values. How much does the politics of California education support or disrupt your ability to get your job done, your mission done in the schools?
Well, obviously, we were very pleased with the fact that Governor Brown stepped forward and sponsored Prop 30 and fought for it, and it did not completely recover for the community colleges the pain, the fiscal pain that they experienced in 3 years. They went down 12% in their revenues, and that took them up about 3 or 4%. And so we haven't yet got back to where we were 4 years ago. So not everything that's done at the state level is disruptive, but occasionally some things are done that are disruptive. And sometimes, well, I'll just give you one illustration that when I was there was a bill that made it more difficult for community colleges to contract out for a particular thing that might happen. And of course it was involved so that it would protect the staff union in terms of that. But take for instance, when I was at Pasadena City College, we didn't, of course, contract out much at all. But when we got ready to paint the 3 major buildings on our campus, we couldn't have possibly gotten that done by using the 2 painters that we had on the staff. We had to contract that out. We didn't fire those 2 painters. They had plenty of work to do. So once in a while you have something that protects somebody, but on the other hand, it makes it more difficult for the individual, such as the president or anyone else there, to operate because of certain rules that are there. So those are kind of things that one segment is carrying a bill that is designed to particularly help one person, but making it more difficult for the school in general to operate. So sometime, as Carl was talking about, what we really need is some deregulation in the education code, because sometimes it's very laborious and very difficult to fulfill the education code. I recall one time when I was out knocking on doors for the election, I knocked on one door and a fellow said to me, "Are you a lawmaker?" And I said, "Well, yes, I am." He said, "Well, I want an unlawmaker." And I had some sympathy for what he was saying, because I recognize that really sometimes some of our regulations are difficult, make it more difficult for a school to operate efficiently. And the education code in California obviously is far too detailed, and as Carl aptly said, it's that high, you know, that it just has a lot of things in it that really would be better if we could delete them. But a lot of times, you know, if you start deleting something, there's an interest group that suddenly raises up and says, "Oh, no, that's what we've got to protect." And the big battle over local control that he's referring to, that Governor Brown is working on, Governor Brown even wants to just completely abolish categorical programs and let the local schools have it and spend it in the way that they want to, with some direction. But a lot of those categorical programs are understandably were actually legislated and adopted in order to protect certain groups. And so I would predict, I don't know what Carl predicts, but I would imagine that that particular suggestion or recommendation of Governor Brown will not be completely fulfilled because there's just too much power involved in some of those categorical groups, and with some good reason.
Carl, one of the disruptions that keeps on giving seems to be Prop 13. This was the property tax cutting initiative from 1978. Was that an aberration, or do you see the effects of politics at the state level as more supportive or disruptive to trying to accomplish your goals in Long Beach?
One of the things that's fascinating, if there's a great documentary out on Governor Brown's dad. It's called A California State of Mind, The Legacy of Pat Brown. And in that documentary, it actually has footage from Howard Jarvis and the people who passed Proposition 13, and they actually used the term Tea Party in that footage in 1978, that what they had done was the equivalent of Tea Party. One of the interesting things about being superintendent in both Long Beach and San Diego, we had full-time lobbyists in Sacramento, which was a testament, and before Proposition 13 passed, we did not. But it was a testament to the fact that all power resides in Sacramento. So if you had a big district and you had the resources, you had a full-time lobbyist in Sacramento that actually attempted to sponsor some things that would help you and would also attempt to keep bad things from happening to you. Back in the early 90s, and Jack's wife at dinner raised the issue of why Long Beach and Pasadena are so different. And one of the things that's different, Long Beach is the first, Long Beach school system, the regular public school system is the first choice of parents. In Pasadena, That is not the case. All kinds of people, including CGU graduate students who live in Pasadena, have their kids in private schools. And I would argue one of the differences is that in Long Beach, we addressed values long before other school systems. So the mantra that I inherited from the Long Beach School Board when I was selected was high standards, dress, behavior, and achievement. And dress took the form of a school uniform policy. Now it's interesting, when we started down the road, we wanted a school uniform policy just like any private school can have a school uniform policy. And Willie Brown, who at the time was the leader of the assembly, said, if the ed code is silent on the topic, you can do it. Don't let anybody tell you that you can't. And the ed code did not mention anything about local school boards and policies on school uniforms. Delane Easton at the time was the chair of the Assembly Education Committee, and a civil liberties interest group got to her, and so she decided that she would sponsor a bill that would require a parental opt-out for any district that sponsored a school uniform policy. It ended up that 95% of our parents went with the school uniform policy, and so it didn't end up destroying the program, but it's an example of how, on the one hand, you had Willie Brown saying one thing, and then a powerful legislator chairing a committee and saying, you know what, in my way of thinking about public education, I don't like what Long Beach is doing, and therefore I'm going to do something about it.
Well, we've covered a lot of territory here in terms of conflicts, groups, values, and resources, and we're about to open it up to you for your questions, but and we'll have a couple of microphones that are circulating here, but while those microphones are getting turned on, let me ask Jack and Carl just to say, if you could change one or two things in the politics here that change would help us serve and educate children and young adults, what would it be? What's the big bugaboo in California politics?
Well, I'll tell you about two or three things that I think are bad about the structure. I think it was a very good thing that was passed by initiative that said that a budget could be passed by a simple majority. Frankly, I think the same thing should be true of taxes. We're one of the few states that requires a 2/3 vote to raise taxes. That, the federal government doesn't require it. It'd have to go through both houses and be approved by the governor. But we've got to get a 2/3 vote, which really means that 1/3 can hold up anything like that. That empowers, and I'm enough of somebody who believes in a democracy to think that a majority is a majority and not a 2/3. That's one problem we have. A second problem is, and we may open up a can of worms here, I don't think term limits has proved to be a good thing as far as the quality of the legislators. I think that it was well-intentioned, but I don't think it's a good thing. And then let me say one thing about Prop 13 real quickly. Do you realize, well, number one, as Carl pointed out, it put a lot of power in the hands of the state rather than on the local board. The local board before could levy taxes, and if indeed the people didn't like it, they could not elect that person. Now that all comes from the state. But one of the things that it ended up doing was that in 1978, when Prop 13 was passed, 60% of the taxes came from commercial and 40% came from residential. Today it's just the reverse, because of the fact that commercial property stays in the hands of the owners longer than residential property does. So there's a disparity that if you ever tried to change it, it would be very difficult, because I guarantee you that the commercial powers would be dead set against it.
Carl, what would you change?
I might consider some sort of a California constitutional convention that would look at the initiative process. You're never going to get rid of it. It's rooted in the history of California, but Hiram Johnson's idea basically was a good one, to empower ordinary citizens to directly engage in government. And now the initiative process really has lost its moorings, and I think some sort of changes that would limit the amount of corporate and union money going to initiatives, I think would make for a good discussion. I'm not optimistic about it passing.
Okay, your turn. Who has questions? It's Linda.
Oh, this is Carl.
And wait a minute, hey, Linda, there's a, right behind you, Kariko.
I was intrigued by your comments about the Walton Foundation. So are they scanning the country doing this? And what's the incentive? They target certain communities? Why, because of Walmart or what? I mean, they clearly have an anti-union bent to what they do. And in addition to finding out about the money that they provided to pastors, they also met with me, and they wanted to know, are you going to continue the top-down reforms of your predecessor? And when I said no, they actually pulled their money from the San Diego school system. And I mean, they do not hide what they're about.
Conservative politicians tend to think that the charter schools are the magic way to improve education. It's kind of like a mantra with them.
Yes, sir, in the back.
Thank you for your, okay. I'll just stand up, it's not working. Thank you for your time, first of all. It's an all-encompassing question, so feel free to answer specifically or ambiguously. We're trying to include education and policymakers, citizens, and students in this question. Oh, okay. This better? There we
Yep.
go. Okay. When we look today at public employee unions having to change pensions, most companies no longer offer pensions, and for the first time, student debt has outpaced credit card debt. Along with that, college costs outpace inflation, I believe, at least by 20%. At the same time, no longer the days of one job for your life here anymore. Do you feel that either in high schools or colleges, and whatever your feelings might be, hence the ambiguous nature of the question, do you feel faculty, staff, parents recognize that the flexible need for teaching and the flexible need for what we're doing is more important than ever, so that when people enter the working world, they're not just focused only in one area when inevitably things change and they have to transfer to a different job? I hope I'm being clear with that question.
Say that all again.
Well,
No, hang on, I think we've got an answer coming here.
I don't know that I have an answer, but I think one of the most dreadful things that's happened in the last 10 years are the number of pink slips that go out to public school teachers, and I think that is so discouraging to anyone who is contemplating becoming a teacher. Not only is the salaries are not that good, but when you are in college and suddenly you read about, and after all, the ones who are laid off obviously are the ones with the least seniority, and so you think, shall I go into public school teaching and after the first year I'll get a layoff? And so and that, by the way, I'm not blaming the schools for that. That's as a result of the lack of money. Schools are doing what they have to do to survive when they lay off individuals. But I'm just saying that has to have a tremendously negative effect on college students who are considering going into the teaching profession.
That's what I was referring to.
Yeah, and I think defined benefit pensions are in fact a good thing. And I worry if they're sustainable financially, but I worry about the argument that somehow we should reduce everybody to pension plans that are controlled by the marketplace. When I was a federal court monitor for the special education consent decree in Los Angeles, I was always troubled when people said, unless you subject kids with disabilities to all the indignities that regular kids are subjected to, you don't have equity. And I think that that's the wrong point of view. I think pensions, public sector pensions, were a good idea. We've got to figure out how to financially sustain them. But I don't think making them the type of pensions that all of my contemporaries who are in the private sector and lost tremendous amounts of money as they move toward retirement, I don't think that's a good idea.
Would you mind if I added something on the issue of pensions? I will, I may sound defensive here, but if you look at the STRS pension, the CalSTRS pension, that's not an excessive pension. The excessive pensions that people are speaking out against are the ones that generally are often locally granted by cities that have caused cities to go broke. And in some cases, the safety employees have rather good pensions. And once again, all you have to do is look at politics. If you're on the city council, and what do you want as an endorsement? Well, you want the police and the fire as an endorsement, and the police and fire endorsement may have something to do with what your views might be on the issue of pensions. So, if you think that the average public school teacher is got some kind of huge pension, it's not true. Those excessive things like what happened in the city of Bell, for instance, that's a city problem right there. And that's horrific, and I have no sympathy for it. But I have to tell you that as far as I don't see many public school teachers who spent 30 years in the public school system of being exceedingly rich.
Yes, sir.
And don't forget that if you taught in a public school system and you spent 30 years in business before you went there, that you still lose 40% of your Social Security.
Yeah.
Yes.
It might need just a second to turn on.
What are your thoughts concerning standardized testing and maybe some of your prospects for reform if needed in that arena, particularly as it relates to primary school?
I serve as the chair of the ACT board in Iowa City, and actually, point of pride, but we've actually passed the SAT and the number of tests that we give. But I also think that the world of assessment is changing dramatically, and I think there's a coming pushback against excessive testing, and I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with the Common Core and the 2 assessment consortia that are involved in developing these new tests. I volunteer in a first grade classroom at Colin Powell School in Long Beach. It's on the North Long Beach Compton border. I work with 30 poor kids of color and their teacher, and I've seen a shift taking place where I used to be able to be this great grandfather figure who read what I call very cool Bill Pete books to the kids. And now I'm engaged in all kinds of activities that are designed to prepare these youngsters for assessment. And I would argue vehemently that the youngsters were better off when I'm reading them the Bill Pete books than they are in these awkward, mind-numbing exercises that are designed to get them ready from some benchmark assessment that's coming in the next 2 weeks. I think we're taking the joy out of learning. I recently spoke to the administrators of the Catholic schools from Los Angeles, Orange County, and San Diego, and they're sometimes worried about declining enrollment. And I told them, as long as you teach kids, you are going to be fine, because there's a time coming when parents are going to opt for schools that are teaching kids. And I talked to them about the example of Sister Martin, a member of the Immaculate Heart community, who taught this poor kid to read in the first grade without the benefit of kindergarten. I did well on tests because Sister Martin taught me, not because she prepared me to take tests. You can see I have a little passion around this issue.
In a minute, Carl will tell us what he really thinks. Who's next? Yes, ma'am. It's on.
Professor Cohn, so you talked about how much of school funding, 50 and 60%, for some schools is coming from corporations and foundations. And I'm curious to know about major takeovers by corporations and big business of school districts, and how that's shaping the political conversation around education reform and what's being put on the agenda. I don't know if you're familiar with what happened in Lawrence, Massachusetts. I have a couple of friends who actually work in that district, and they were telling me how big business came in and they pretty much did a mass firing of very dedicated teachers. They and then brought in and they brought in, Teach for America folks, and then it bred a climate of distrust and a hostile and very toxic atmosphere, both for teaching and learning. And so I'm wondering, if you could talk more about these takeovers, and are we going to see more of it? To my knowledge, there have only been 2. One of being Lawrence, Massachusetts, and I don't know if they've been very, very successful.
You can take over a school system by selecting a new kind of superintendent. So you have the phenomena And I need to disclose this. I have worked as a consultant for both the Broad and the Gates Foundation. The Broad Superintendent's Academy basically takes people from other leadership roles, also some educators, but some have been military leaders, and they train them in a 10-month program to head urban school systems around the country. And so you have, through these new superintendents, stronger commitments to the corporate reform agenda. So it's not quite as clear as you might think it is. And some of them are good people. So I don't think anybody should conclude, that they actually believe they have a powerful sense of urgency around the rescue of kids who historically haven't been well served. And so they start with the data. What does the data tell you about what's happened to kids in this system? Where I would part company, they automatically conclude that those techniques that are used in the corporate world will automatically rescue those kids who historically haven't been well served. So in addition to a constant focus on let's fire 10, 15, 20% of the people because that's what a good corporation does on a regular basis, that's what we have to bring. And then any of those schools in dicey neighborhoods that are under-enrolled, let's close them and bring in new charter management companies to run them. Not all charter management companies are bad, but some of them, when you look at the data after several years, are no better than the traditional public school that was there. And so I part company on the issue of, we know that these techniques, firing a lot of people, closing a lot of schools, generating as much conflict as possible, 1,000 flowers will bloom in terms of student performance. You just can't find the evidence for that. But when you look internationally, globally, at the systems that are doing better at the K-12 level, they have not adopted the drivers of reform that we've adopted. And so that's why I think you need to approach this with a great deal of caution.
Hi. I'm actually the daughter of two public school teachers living high off the hog on their STRS pension in their $100,000 house in Visalia, California. But anyway, and I've also received a RIF for 3 times in the past 5 years. But anyway, I have a question for Dr. Scott. I think that you spoke about the public interest groups, all the special interest groups, and I wanted to know if there is any way of building a bridge between some of those special interest groups. For instance, like the teachers' unions, the community college employees union, the Cal State teacher, faculty union. I mean, would there be a way of building a coalition and making them more powerful, especially when it comes to budgets in California?
Well, I think certainly in my role as president, college president, I always built a coalition with the teacher unions. That didn't mean we always agreed on everything, but I never thought that a president could operate and pose himself or herself as an opponent of the faculty. That's not going to work at all. For instance, I was proud to receive the endorsement of CTA and CFT when I ran for office. So I don't, but that didn't mean that every issue that they backed that I would necessarily march in tune with, because their interest was to represent teachers, and I don't blame them for that. I don't want to sound simplistic, but my job was to represent students. And once in a while, I would find us in conflict. For instance, I found it unfortunate that in some urban schools that it had been collectively bargained that a teacher could voluntarily transfer to another school, and the school had to accept that teacher. Now, in Los Angeles, unfortunately, that became known as the dance of the lemons. And so I initiated a bill that attacked that, particularly in the lower 3 decile schools. And I got a lot of sympathy from a lot of legislators, particularly those in areas of color, because they felt like that they were getting some maybe poor teachers that were pushed off on them. And so, fortunately, a majority of both parties voted for that bill, and it was signed into law. So I don't think you, if you're a legislator, you don't give up your independence to anybody. You don't say, I'm going to march always with this group or that group. And so I'd say 90% of the issues, I would find myself in coalition with the teacher unions, because I believe, obviously, they fought hard for increased funding, which I felt our schools were underfunded. They fought hard for some other things that I believed in. I remember a professor of mine once said that in relation to any institution, ride loose in the saddle. And I thought that's pretty good advice. I didn't give my heart and soul to any party, to any institution, because that's not what I could do. Now, I'm not saying I always did the right thing. I'm sure I made some mistakes. But I'm just saying, no, I think if you're, I'm sure that Carl would agree with me that he had a lot of very fine conversations with teacher unions. And, you know, a lot of times they would naturally, when they had their list of, when we began to negotiate a contract, they normally had a list about that long. And when we got through negotiating, it was a list about that long. And that's the way negotiation is. And probably the Board of Trustees had a list about that long. And so you'd come, that's what I talked about when I said you should never get involved in name-calling, rancorous. You don't want to personalize things of that nature. It's very hard to keep that out. And but that's, you know, we all have a perspective. And, you know, I'm a very subjective, well, all of us are subjective human beings. Our real problem gets into the fact that when we think we're not subjective, we think we're in some way or another, our role naturally has us in a, and I was very glad to identify with the party. I happen to be a Democrat, and I didn't feel uncomfortable at all identifying with that party. And I can tell you all kinds of reasons why I didn't feel uncomfortable. But on the other hand, that didn't mean that I had to march completely to the sound of that drum.
You know, another example, I had a very good relationship with the teachers union in Long Beach, but I was reconstituting 2 schools in the late 90s, long before reconstitution was popular. So everybody in the schools had to apply and be interviewed for their job. So comes the school board meeting where this is going to be approved by the board. The executive director of the Teachers Association, met with me that afternoon before the board meeting started. And she said, Carl, at the beginning of the meeting, for 15 minutes straight, we are going to say horrible things about you. And then after that 15 minutes, you get to go ahead and do what you want to do. That's politics.
I could tell a similar story. One time I went to the head of the teachers union and I said, we're not paying our part-time teachers enough. And I said, we're going to raise their salaries. He was a full-time teacher, and that wasn't his deepest concern. And so, but I said, you can do that. You can put that on the list. And he did, and he took credit for it, and that was just fine. We got our way.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you both for your time. I really enjoyed the lecture and knowing just the importance in terms of politics and how they intersect with education and as educators. So my question for you is, what is your advice or your thoughts to people who have been disillusioned or let down by politics or politicians? What are your thoughts in regaining that hope, that trust to get back and organizing and seeing that change through that avenue? And that's for both of you.
You know, if you visit the JFK Library in Massachusetts, over the library, it says dedicated to all those who through the art of politics. You know, if you really want to accomplish great things for children, knowing and understanding politics is critical to doing that. There are so many people that I've ended up mentoring, and a lot of them are women who know, I was going to say 10 times more about instruction than I do, probably 50 times more about instruction than I do. But if you can convince them that they can take the next step and absolutely move away from assistant superintendent instruction, executive director of curriculum and instruction, and get in to the superintendent's office, fully knowing how to navigate the politics that comes with that job, you can do great things and you'll be more satisfied. One of the people that I mentored when I was superintendent in San Diego came from the Harvard program. Last Thursday night, she was selected as the new superintendent in Madison, Wisconsin. And the first thing she did was call me up and say, thank you for getting me to focus on politics.
This has been a time when we've focused a lot on Lincoln, the movie and all the rest. I think if you look at the abolitionist and you look at Lincoln, you see two different approaches. Reinhold Niebuhr once called the abolitionist position a prophet, and that's necessary. But there's also the necessity of someone who had to do things in a gradual way because that's all the nation could take. And maybe he wasn't quite as far along as he should have been. But, you know, he didn't do the Emancipation Proclamation at the beginning of the Civil War. He did it a little bit later when he could. So that's kind of what, you know, if you want to be a prophet, there's a road for you. You say your message, and there's no compromise, and you want that message to go out. If you're going to be with an institution and you want to head an institution, then you've got to recognize that you can't get it all done immediately. Now, on the other hand, the real temptation is to be corrupted in that political role and finally become self-serving. So you lose your idealism. The danger, as Reinhold Niebuhr would say, of the prophet is self-righteousness. I'm right and everybody else is wrong, and I'm going to say this idealistic thing from now on. And so each one has its temptation and each one has its place. I don't think that slavery would have been abolished without the abolitionists, or it would have eventually been abolished, because I don't think it could have maintained itself forever, but I'm just saying, they had a role to play. Lincoln had a role to play. So, and Lincoln's role was that of a politician, and their role was that of a prophet. And the same thing's true in a school. It's just what Carl's saying. Here was a woman who had some skills. She was a great teacher. The only thing, probably, you know, there used to be an old saying that if you can't teach, administrate. But the reality is, those who get into administration for the right reason realize that that's a way that your influence can extend beyond the classroom in the selection of personnel, in the adoption of policies, in moving a school in the right direction, as Carl so adeptly did at Long Beach.
We have time for one more, and that belongs to you, David.
I think I can speak loudly enough. In the context of this discussion, I was reminded of something Paul Albrecht once said to me. Thank you.
Can you hear this?
Yep.
Yes. We're in Albrecht Auditorium. Paul Albrecht was a very successful administrator and leader, academic leader of this institution. And when I once was having a conversation with him about the meaning of management and leadership, he said to me, "You know, David, institutions don't kiss back."
And on that note, the microphone turns back to Scott.
Thank you, David Drew. Thank you all. I'd also like to thank the faculty of the School of Educational Studies. I see several of you out there, so many of you out there that I won't try to list the name of at least 10. The staff of the school who have made this possible. The students who have facilitated an environment in which we can ask questions like this comfortably and aggressively. John Regan, whose generosity, his material generosity, is making this annual lecture series possible. And last but not least, of course, Jack Scott, Carl Cohn, and Jacob Adams. Please give them a round of applause.